On today's World Insight with Tian Wei, how do you solve a problem like Brexit? Britain's Prime Minister caught between a rock and a hard place.
More talking will not change the questions that need to be settled.
And what are the biggest challenges to China's equity market? A government advisor sheds some light.
To allow the market increasingly to play its own role.
Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei. The program is coming to you live on CGTN. We start our show today in the UK, where Parliament will vote again on the government's divorce deal with the European Union on Tuesday. Yes, indeed, that is another new deadline. If lawmakers rejected the plan, the British Prime Minister will either have to negotiate a Brexit delay or let Britain out of the EU with no deal. Many fear that a no-deal Brexit would cause huge economic disruptions. What are the likely Brexit scenarios, and is the UK any closer to its exit goal? Before our discussion, take a look.
The Brexit clock is ticking for Britain. The UK is due to leave the European Union on March 29, but the country is nowhere close to a breakthrough. Brexit talks between the UK and the EU remain deadlocked just a day before MPs are due to vote again on Prime Minister Theresa May's deal. Mrs. May is warning lawmakers that if they reject her Brexit divorce deal, Britain may never leave the EU.
If we were simply asking for a bit more time to pass the legislation we need to implement Brexit once we've agreed the deal, a delay would be straightforward. But if it were a delay to give MPs even more time to decide what we're going to do, the EU might insist on new conditions that were not in our interest before they agreed to such an extension. And that might lead to a form of Brexit that does not match up to what people voted for. It could mean no end to free movement, no ability to strike our own trade deals, no end to the big annual payments, no taking back control, which is what the British people voted for.
This week, there are three crucial votes that will decide which way the Brexit tide would turn. First, on Tuesday, MPs are scheduled to vote on Mrs. May's plan for Britain's departure. If she wins, Britain would be on course to exit the European bloc on the 29th. But there is still no consensus over her plan, and she is likely to lose the first vote. If that happens, she'd be back to square one, leading to a second vote on Wednesday. The MPs would then vote on leaving the Union without a deal. Experts say Parliament is expected to reject this possibility too, as it would likely be economically catastrophic for the UK. Staunch Brexiteers would back this vote, but they don't seem to have the necessary numbers. A second rejection would open the possibility of a third and final vote on Thursday, when lawmakers would decide whether to delay the exit date. An extension would require a separate approval from the EU. Observers say a delay is among the most likely scenarios, but critics point out that extending the deadline still leaves the Brexit puzzle unsolved. There are many questions that remain unanswered. What happens if MPs vote down all three proposals? If a delay is approved, what new compromises could the EU offer the UK if they're willing to renegotiate at all?
For the latest discussion on Brexit in London, we have Ian Begg, a professor at the European Institute and co-director of the Durrandor Forum of the London School of Economics and Political Science. Welcome, sir. In Brussels, we are joined by Fraser Cameron, senior advisor at the European Policy Center in Brussels. Thank you, sir, for joining us. And in Beijing, Cui Hongjian, director of the Department for European Studies at the China Institute of International Studies. Gentlemen, welcome to our program. I am almost losing track, Professor Begg, of all the deadlines and the possible deadlines to come in the future. Help us to understand exactly what we are talking about when we are illustrating and mapping out these deadlines.
Well, the first important deadline is the 29th of March, which
Yes.
is barely 400 hours away, never mind days. And that's the one that is because Britain triggered the process for leaving the European Union, known as Article 50, nearly 2 years ago, and the treaty prescribes a 2-year deadline. Now, there is the possibility for that to be extended by agreement of both sides, which is the third vote that was mentioned in your piece. I think it's likely that will occur, that both the European side and the British side will say, we cannot solve this in the next 400 hours, therefore we have to go ahead with delaying it. And in fact, former Prime Ministers have come out and said this. Sir John Major has said it a few days ago, and today the LSE has published a blog by Gordon Brown saying the same thing. We need an extension, otherwise it's going to be chaos.
But Mr. Cameron, of course, we've also heard quotes coming from the French EU minister. When being asked about an extension, she answered, an extension for what? What to come in the future, even if there's an extension? Obviously, she's trying to say. Mr. Cameron, do you think a lot of the other capitals really pin a lot of hope about what London can achieve?
No, it's a pretty good question. What will an extension achieve? I mean, the plain fact is the British have not been able to secure a parliamentary approval for the deal that they signed up to last year, and therefore the other member states are saying, well, it's pretty chaotic in London, in the Parliament. We must be pretty sure that the Parliament will approve any deal before we can think about making any changes. And at the moment, Parliament is all over the place, as you explained in your piece. So until the chaotic situation in London is resolved, I don't see the EU moving at all.
Professor Begg, you want to respond to that. Can London be able to, shall I say, clean its own house and be able to present itself, at least apparently as a whole, to Brussels?
Well, the reason for the chaos is that Theresa May set out in this negotiating process with what's called red lines, the things that she was not prepared to compromise on. And once she did that, she limited the space for negotiation on a future relationship with the EU. The deal that she secured respects her red lines, but it's loved by nobody. So the thing that has to go is her red lines before you can make progress on this. And that does require both compromise from the British side, but then a willingness on the European side to reopen discussion. And that is the principal motivation for extending Article 50, is to break down these artificial barriers that have made it impossible to secure a deal.
Well, Mr. Cameron, even though Professor Begg said that nobody likes it, but after all, she is still the Prime Minister of Britain, and she experienced several earlier votes, whether she will be off from that job or not, and eventually she survived. So obviously, Britain still supports this leader, at least for now. So can we blame her, just one person, for all the mistakes? Is it fair, Mr. Cameron?
No, there's several people you can blame, starting with David Cameron. But the point is, the leadership of the Conservative Party is now wide open. She's basically a lame duck. They're all circling her corpse, waiting for the moment to strike. She's no authority left in the British Parliament or the British country. So it's really a chaotic scene. And extending the deadline, you have to ask yourself, well, as Professor Begg said, would the Parliament accept going back on these red lines? Because if you accept British membership of the single market, it means accepting free movement of people. And that seems to me anathema to the majority of the Conservative Party.
Mr. Cui, you've been attentively listening to your two colleagues from the European continent, and of course you come in as an observer of the next step to come. Optimistic at all?
It's difficult to say we could be optimistic for the result, for the outcome for the forthcoming vote, especially a clear or orderly or smooth Brexit process will happen.
That's too many adjectives for the reality, please, Mr.
Yes,
Cui.
exactly. So I think now the major problem for this issue is now the Brexit is not Brexit itself. It is entangled already with political struggles between the different parties, between the different members of the Conservative Party in UK. So I think, yes, it's difficult for us to understand once we have extension of Article 5, of Article 15,
Right.
there will be another half year or even 1 year more time. So we could not imagine that in another half of a year, it could finish the negotiation.
Wow.
Because we have, Britain and the EU already spent nearly 2 years. So I think now the big problem is how could UK especially, for the government or for the parliament, who will make the final decision? Who can take the majority, not only for the parliament and also for the majority of the British people?
I don't have the authority to answer that, by the way. So, Professor Beck, you want to jump in on that? You have better prediction?
I think we're at the position now where it's clear that the government is not able to make a clear-cut decision on this because the government itself is divided. Parliament is divided into several camps which are mutually exclusive. And there is then one way in which you can decide this, which is go back to a process of deliberation with the people. In France, as you may know, President Macron has launched his great debate, le grand débat, in which he's trying to take soundings from all sources to think about the way the country moves forward. And there is now a groundswell in this country for having something similar. Consultations in each region among different groupings, unions, employers and so on, as a way to test what the country as a whole wants. And then to say, after that process of deliberation, either Parliament decides or it has to go back to a second referendum of the people in which the final decision will be made. Without that kind of process, I can't see a way out of this logjam.
I see. Mr. Cameron, of course, the Brits might be enjoying themselves, so here I use a quote mark, of course, doing their stress test, but Brussels, does Brussels have to be a play companion all the time?
Actually, the mood is changing in Brussels. There's a feeling of exasperation with Theresa May and the UK. I would say quite a number of people say, look, the Brits have had their time to negotiate. It was a good deal. If you don't want it, sorry, bye-bye. And it's time for the Brits to go and find out if life outside the EU is actually as rosy as they think it will be. So I think, you know, there's not going to be any more sort of major changes from the EU side. They think they've compromised enough. It's the Brits who actually wanted to leave, so they must decide what they actually want to end up doing.
But Mr. Cameron, I have to point out that this is a negotiation, isn't it? I mean, in the negotiation, different sides just pretend with their attitudes from time to time. That's also one factor. Mr. Cameron, what is the real pose in Brussels from your knowledge?
Well, it's not really a negotiation when it's, you know, one member state leaving. I mean, the leverage is actually all on the EU side. It's the same when a country wants to join the EU. You talk about negotiations. It's not negotiations. That country has to accept all the EU rules and regulations. So when the country leaves, it's going to be pretty cold out there unless they basically align themselves as close as possible to the EU. So that's what's under discussion just now. It's not a real negotiation in terms of, you know, how you would actually work out any future arrangement. That's still to come, by the way. People think that next week, if you get a deal, that's the end of it. It's not. It's actually only the beginning of it, because Britain will be locked in negotiations for the next 10 years with the European Union.
Right. Professor Begg, before I go to other topics, I really want to ask you about that too, which is the more struggle, inner struggle Britain has, the belittling process, it seems, that Britain is presenting itself to the rest of Europe will continue, and probably even more. And that is going to have a big collateral damage on the negotiation power, if we could still use that word, between London and Brussels, one have to argue.
Well, I agree with Fraser on this. You do realise you're speaking to two Scots in Fraser and I, and we see this from a slightly different perspective from the English, that what's going on here is a very asymmetric negotiation. There's one supplicant, which is the UK, and one other side which has all the cards really in its deck. And in this case, the reddest of red lines that Theresa May has set up is to say we must respect the result of the 2016 referendum. She's taken that as an untouchable political fact. Now then the question that really should be posed is, the referendum that gave rise to Brexit occurred nearly 3 years ago. opinion polls now tell us that the opinion has shifted away from favouring leaving the EU. Younger people who are more in the voting population now, in the electorate, than they were in the past, are very strongly in favour of something that affects their future, which is staying in the EU. So the political dynamics do change. After all, in our normal electoral cycle in the UK, we change we potentially change the government every 4 or 5 years.
Right.
How long should the mandate from a referendum last is the fundamental question at the core of this.
Right. Besides the referendum earlier, 2 years ago, Mr. Cui, we seldom heard what exactly could represent the public's voice. As we know, there's divisions, as the two gentlemen brilliantly illustrated, so many of them within the UK Parliament. So we also heard recently about the new piece written by Gordon Brown, blaming the politicians inside the Parliament, their difficulties to come up with consensus and delaying the whole development process of the UK as a result. So, Mr. Cui, my question to you is, eventually, who will have a say? Is it the politicians who take politics as their game, their daily game, or is it likely to be another grand-scale decision-making way, like something similar to the referendum?
Yes, now it's, I think, a very difficult game, even for the Brexit, for maybe the British political structure at large. Because we can find very interesting issue for this Brexit is where is the legitimacy for the decision maker.
Right.
Once it happened, like 2 years ago, 3 years ago, for this referendum, at that time it looks like it's the people to make a decision by voting something. So now, then the government, Theresa May's government, want to take back the authority from the people, from the Parliament, say that, okay, now it's government to decide everything about the Brexit. But now the current situation is the Parliament is trying to take the power from the hand of the government, say that now let's go back to the parliamentary democracy. So I think now, yes, from a people to a government and to a Parliament, always the deadlock is not only a deadlock between EU and the UK. Really, it's a deadlock between people, government, and Parliament.
So, Ms. Cameron, how does Brussels see the nature of this change as interpreted by Mr. Cui?
How does Brussels view what's going on?
View the relationship between the public, the government, led by the Prime Minister, and then the Parliament. How is Brussels likely to play the cards among the differences between these three different factors?
Well, the point is you've got 27 member states who are all members of a club. Inside that club, you have certain privileges and you protect each other. And when one member decides to leave, they're obviously not going to get any sort of special favours. Now, as regards how you deal with the UK, you have to deal with the government of the day. I mean, obviously, people here following the debates in the media and the Parliament, but ultimately, a deal has to be signed by the government. And the government, as Professor Begg said, is divided, it's weak, and therefore, until you get a UK government able to command a majority for a policy in the House of Commons, it's very difficult for Brussels to do anything to influence that. They're actually in a waiting game now.
Will the business community particularly suffer as a result of this? We've already been reading some of the so-called short-term effect on businesses. Those who have contingency plans looking at March the 29th seem to be having also some problems compared to those who do not, because you possibly will have an extension of the deadline. So one unpredictability after another, whether you're prepared for it or you're not prepared for it, both are a question, isn't it? Quoting Shakespeare.
Do you want me to answer that one?
That would be perfect, Professor Begg.
The business community hates uncertainty. Uncertainty is being introduced into the system by the fact that we have the the uncertainty over the date of Brexit, the uncertainty over the future relationship, and you see this translating into a low level of investment in the economy. Britain has the lowest investment rate in the EU after Greece, which is not exactly the most stirring example. We also see a slow process of attrition where jobs, other forms of economic activity are leaving the UK. In fact, there was a study published this morning that suggests that in the financial sector, as much as £1 trillion worth of assets has left the EU to other places like Dublin, Frankfurt, Paris and so on. And to put that in context, £1 trillion is roughly half of 1 year's GDP in the UK. So the risks are all on the downside for the business community, and they don't like it. They want this to be settled, and settled in a way which preserves the trading relationship with the rest of the EU.
As a result, Mr. Cameron, will the businesses escape to the other capitals on the European continent, or still the UK is very attractive until it's not?
Yes, I mean, a good example is the Japanese. I mean, to my astonishment, the Japanese government sent a memo to the UK shortly after the referendum saying, hang on, you promised that if we come and invest in the UK, we would have automatic access to the single market. Now you've broken that promise, and they've kept up this pressure right up until a couple of weeks ago when Jeremy Hunt, the Foreign Secretary, and Liam Fox, the Trade Secretary, pleaded with the Japanese government to finalise an FDA deal, which is impossible, of course, in the 2 weeks. So the British government thought they would get about 40 trade deals in place by the time of Brexit. They've got 2 with the Faroe Islands and with Costa Rica. So, you know, it's an illusion to think that somehow leaving the EU means taking back control in a meaningful way. It's going to be a painful lesson for the EU, but at the moment, other continental cities, countries, are actually benefiting short-term from the flow of investment jobs away from the UK to the continent.
Mr. Cui, of course, the UK case is a very interesting one for the rest of the world. As we know, that has a lot to do with the unilateralism, protectionism, and also the new trends that we have unfortunately seen in the rest of the world. So, Mr. Cui, do you think other capitals will take lesson from what's going on right now in the UK and the uncertain future as a result of the Brexit decision? Or this is going to be just one of those stories you're going to see on the headlines a lot, while others will continue to fall into their own trap that they created themselves?
Well, I would like to say to know something or to hear something from London, also to do something by itself, it's a very different two things. As we know now, yes, we can find so many, different or various factors from the Brexit process, including the a kind of populism, a kind of nationalism, a kind of maybe even isolation from outside world. But even now in other, especially European capitals, we can find out almost the similar, drama are playing. I think that yes, now different countries they do have different concerns, different challenges. But I think that yes, we could get some very, very serious lessons from the Brexit, which means that firstly we need to find out maybe what's the real interest for country, for people, and then how could we find out maybe a order for the power, and we could find out a more rational mechanism for decision making.
All of these tasks are easy said than done. Well, the UK is in a boiling water that it created itself in order to figure out what kind of future they want. Professor Begg, Mr. Cameron, and Mr. Cui, before we go, very briefly from every one of you, what can we expect until March the 29th? I'm probably a little bit over that time. Professor Begg, you want to put your bet here?
My bet would be that Theresa May will lose the vote tomorrow, and that will trigger an extension of the Article 50 negotiating process. The big question then is how long that extension is. Some are calling for it to be not just a couple of months, but over a year, with all the problems that will cause.
All right. Mr. Cui?
I agree with Professor Burke, because it's not I mean, rational choice or option for the Brexit. It's, I think, the only way to find out the way approach of soft landing of the Brexit process.
I see. Mr. Cameron, last but not least.
I think there will be an extension, but it should not be more than 3 or 4 months. Otherwise, you get into very difficult legal arguments about participation in the European Parliament elections and the budget, etc. So I think a shortish extension, but ultimately the British Parliament is going to be forced to take a decision sooner rather than later.
Fraser Cameron, Ian Beck, Cui Hongjian, what a pleasure, gentlemen, to have you on our program for this discussion. One after another deadline. Thanks to your insight, we'll be able to catch up with all of these latest developments. Thank you once again.